In 1864, in the mountains of Minas Gerais, a powerful landowner made a choice that would weaponize the bodies of 7 men and unravel a family's name. Colonel Augusto Ferreira da Costa arranged for 7 of the people he owned to lie with his wife in an effort to produce heirs. The bargain was not a private scandal only. It was an act born of a legal and social order that treated human beings as property and children as assurances of lineage and power. To understand how such a thing could be conceived and why it would be accepted, however reluctantly, by those around it, we must first undo a few layers of context. Brazil in the 1860s remained a slaveholding society. Laws and customs endorsed the ownership of people, and among the landed elites of Minas Gerais, the continuity of a family line mattered as much as land or the title of colonel itself. Honor, inheritance, and the visible signs of proper descent governed behavior and decisions in ways that to us now look perversely instrumental. Augusto Ferreira da Costa, according to contemporary records, was a man of means and of reputation, or at least of the concern for reputation. He stood in his early 50s, the head of a fazenda that rose from terraced fields and steep hillsides, its house a whitewashed presence above coffee and cattle. He occupied public offices in the municipal sphere, participated in local militias, and moved among the social rituals of Ouro Preto's elite. His wife, known in parish registers and household inventories as Dona Esperança, was 15 his junior. She is recorded as being about 35 at the moment the events unfolded. The marriage, according to letters and family accounts, had endured 15 years without producing children. For a man of his class in that moment, childlessness was not merely a private sorrow, it was a political and economic vulnerability. Estates needed heirs to pass titles and preserve names. Widely circulating ideas about heredity, social fitness, and the responsibilities of patriarchs created pressure to secure lineage by any means that, for the colonel, remained within the realm of possibility. The immediate spark that moved the colonel to action appears in a cousin's correspondence. A surviving letter, cited by contemporary municipal papers and later referred to in parish logs, recounts a practice whispered among some plantation circles. Where infertility threatened the continuity of a household, owners had arranged controlled encounters with their wives and enslaved men believed capable of siring offspring deemed acceptable by appearance or health. The cousin framed the practice as pragmatic, coldly technical in tone, and proposed it as a solution. For Augusto, the suggestion read as a dangerous promise, a way of manufacturing heirs without openly challenging social mores about lineal continuity. That letter, which local historians treat as the inciting document, is not itself an instruction, but a catalyst. Records indicate it was brought into the colonel's private hands, read more than once. Parish notes later attest that medical men were consulted. Dr. Enrique Almeida, the family physician, whose presence would give a veneer of medical legitimacy to what was planned, appears in entries as someone called to examine Dona Esperança and to certify fertility, or, in this case, the lack of it. The doctor's notes and the colonel's household ledgers show payments and visits that, taken together, illustrate how a private worry became bureaucratic. How, then, did the plan move from idea to logistics? The documentary traces a series of decisions that make visible the machinery of coercion in a slave society. First, the selection of men.
According to household inventories, medical notations, and eyewitness accounts preserved in municipal correspondence, 7 enslaved men were chosen. The criteria, again visible in the record, were disturbingly clinical: physical health, apparent fertility, complexion and hair considered suitable to the social goal of producing offspring who might pass as acceptable within elite circles, and a demeanor that would, the colonel believed, be manageable. Their names survive in the record as individuals stripped of agency, but not of identity: João Crisóstomo, Miguel dos Santos, Antonio da Silva, Pedro Gonçalves, Francisco de Assis, José María, and Luis Carlos. Each name, when expanded to a vignette, hints at a life already full beyond what the colonel imagined. João Crisóstomo had been a herdsman, known among the enslaved community for a quiet steadiness. Miguel dos Santos worked in the coffee groves and was noted for a quickness of hand. Antonio da Silva had long been assigned to the household kitchen and carried with him the marks of early years of hard labor. Pedro Gonçalves handled the carts and the animals. Francisco de Assis had once been given small tasks among the chapel attendants. José María is recorded in ledgers as having resisted certain commands and had been reprimanded and moved in the past. Luis Carlos, who was younger than the others, had recently been apprenticed to the blacksmith's son. These short portraits, pieced together from payroll notes, baptismal entries, and scattered testimonies, show men whose names were catalogued, but whose inner lives are largely left undefined in the archive. The method of selection, the records suggest, involved examination. Dr. Almeida is noted as having inspected the men, prescribed, perhaps, as fit or suitable.
The physician's handwriting in a marginal note indicates measurements and observations that, taken together, read like an early attempt to medicalize fertility, the presence of health, vigor, and no obvious infirmity. It is important to say this plainly. What appears as medical judgment in the documents functioned to justify an inherently coercive and ethically abhorrent plan. The language of fitness was a veneer. Real consent was absent from the outset. Once chosen, the mechanics of the pact were arranged in ways designed to minimize outward scandal and maintain control. The colonel's ledger lists provisions for the house: candles, linens, foodstuffs, and an allotment described as for services rendered. It also records payments to Dr. Almeida beyond ordinary consultations, and a series of entries for watching and security that, read alongside a subsequent municipal complaint, reveal the presence of threats. Notes and later testimonies indicate that the colonel promised privileges for manumission as an incentive and invoked the ultimate sanction, punishment, or even death for refusal. Such threats, explicit in the oral testimonies gathered later and hinted at in payroll anomalies and transfer orders, converted the arrangement into coercion. Family members and religious actors were implicated in different ways. Parish records mention that Padre Antonio Nogueira visited the household on several occasions. The priest's marginalia, terse and formal, do not record a blessing for the plan. Rather, the priest noted attendance at household events and presided over the occasional sacrament. Whether he knew in full of the arrangement is a question the sources treat cautiously. Some parish minutes suggest he was later approached with requests to register births under family names, a request that would put the parish in the awkward position of mediating between social propriety and truth.
The pact itself became, for the people involved, a regimen. Documents from the household describe a weekly schedule, entries for the carriage coming from the main house to the small dwelling, lists assigning men to specific nights, notes on food allowances and clothing given as token compensation. The colonel's instructions, as recorded by a steward whose notebook survives, insisted on secrecy and the maintenance of outward appearances. For those living in the household, secrecy was enforced both by incentive and by fear. What the files do not contain, because the archive rarely preserves the voices of the enslaved in full, is the interior experience of the men and of Dona Esperanza. We must therefore be precise in how we speak of motive and feeling. Records indicate actions. They do not, as a rule, publish inner thoughts.
Even so, moments in the paper trail and later oral fragments provide glimpses of human response. According to testimonies collected by local investigators decades later, João Crisostomo would bring small offerings, flowers plucked from the plantation grounds, and leave them on the edge of the small house's window, a gesture that some recall as an act of tenderness and some as a quiet statement of defiance against being reduced to function. Miguel, it seems, engaged Dona Esperanza in conversation about cloth and the passage of seasons. Antonio kept a small carved wooden toy in his pocket, which he would trace absent-mindedly, a talisman, perhaps, of his own private life. Francisco composed short petitions to heaven during the hours when he found himself alone, murmuring the kind of invocations that slave religion often folded into daily survival. José Maria's resistance, more overt, is recorded in a transfer order. When he flatly refused to be assigned nights under the pretense of a family requirement, he was moved to a distant estate, an act of punishment disguised as logistical necessity. These small gestures, flowers on a sill, a carved toy, a whispered prayer, do not mitigate the violence of what happened. Instead, they reassert the humanity that the system sought to erase. They testify to the fact that even in coercion, people find ways to preserve dignity, to register refusal, and to demonstrate care. Dona Esperanza's role in the documents is maddeningly ambiguous from the archive's perspective. She appears in parish entries, in the physician's notes, and in a handful of letters that mention her name in passing. The colonel's own writings, where available, cast her in the language of ownership, as an extension of the household's owner, but other notes suggest she did not welcome the arrangement. A medical note records a physician's repeated visits, ostensibly to evaluate the state of the woman. A steward's entry remarks on her withdrawn demeanor. Neighbors and later parish records describe her as becoming unusually pale, retreating from social functions, and spending long hours in the private chapel. One surviving witness statement, taken years later during inquiries sparked by the family's decline, recounts her standing by the window, a shawl about her shoulders, watching the mountains, as if seeking a different life. The archives cannot tell us what she thought in those moments, but they do indicate absence of consent by the way actions were carried out in her name and for the colonel's purposes. The psychological weight of the arrangement is visible, too, in the pattern of interactions recorded between the colonel and his household. Once the pact was in motion, the ledger notes an increase in household expenditures on security and maintenance, a euphemism for the measures employed to ensure silence.
The colonel is described by contemporaries as a man who feared exposure more than he feared moral censure. His letters to associates, some of which survive in family collections, hint at a desperation that bordered on obsession. His fears of dying without an heir, of losing the family name, of the estate passing into distant hands. Those fears, records suggest, drove him to rationalize an act that would later be called by neighbors a practical solution. Yet even practical arrangements meet human unpredictability. The small house did not become, as the colonel planned, an efficient factory of heirs. People resisted in ways both overt and subtle. José Maria's refusal led to his transfer, and later to an account in municipal writings that recorded tension on the estate. There are entries showing that two men, at different points, were moved under the pretext of labor requirements, an administrative maneuver that obscured disciplinary motives. The archivist's notes, marginalia made by later researchers, indicate that these moves were remembered in local oral histories as instances of unjust treatment and as seeds of the fracture that would widen in subsequent years. As the regimen unfolded over months, psychological coping and small acts of mutual aid appeared in the domestic perimeter. Records of purchases show the colonel's house ordered not only utilitarian items for the small dwelling, but also an extra set of linens and a modest cradle, entries that do not make explicit what each item represented, but which, read alongside a physician's later note, point toward the success of the colonel's plan in the technical sense of conception. Parish books, kept with their usual bureaucratic precision, reveal the first hint of what the colonel sought to secure, a baptismal entry slated for the family name. The clerk's hand is careful, the notation is small, and the date inscribed in the margin belongs to a month in which neighbors later remembered an unusual hush on the estate. We arrive here at another archive problem. Evidence of outcome can exist before the human consequences are narrated in full. A physician's note, brief and technical, recorded the observation of signs of gestation in Dona Esperanza. No detailed account of her interior life follows in the physician's hand. Medicine of the era rarely recorded emotional states, but the entry had immediate implications. In a society where paternity could be assumed by name and the marks of racial ancestry could be socially read, a pregnancy introduced a new set of calculations: how to present the child, how to manage social recognition, how to guard the family's standing. The weeks that followed the doctor's note were a period of tightrope balancing. Household orders became more frequent, sending supplies to the small house and adjusting the schedules of the men involved.
At the edges of the ledger, the colonel's anxiety can be felt as if through the paper itself: more entries to repair the estate's fences, a larger sum allocated to parish fees, payments for silversmithing that might be used to present a child at a social event. In a society that valued appearances, the child's arrival needed to be curated to fit the narrative the colonel hoped to maintain. But even as documents ticked off expenditures and the physician certified progress, complicating human realities assembled in quieter records. The steward's notebook mentions a cradle, berceau, bought with the colonel's funds but left unassembled for weeks, perhaps because the household could not reconcile celebration with the unspeakable means by which the pregnancy had been achieved. A marginal note by an overseer speaks of awkwardness among servants and of hushed conversations near the chapel. A neighbor's later recollection, recorded in an oral deposit, speaks of the muttered disapproval of women in the parish, their opinions constrained by the need to be polite while still reacting morally to what they sensed. At the center of these tensions was the question of consent, or rather its absence. Records show the colonel's insistence on obedience, the steward's enforcement through transfers and threats, and the men's withdrawals of their own agency. Yet, where the archive is silent about interior suffering, gestures and fragments carry a heavy moral force.
The flowers João left, the toy Antonio kept, the whispered prayers of Francisco. These small acts open a register of human dignity that resists erasure. For Dona Esperanza, the physician's visits, the parish clerk's preparations, and the colonel's purchases together hint at a life progressively constrained by others' decisions. At a certain point, the paper trail reveals a turning. The evidence of gestation moves the household from planning to performance. Preparations accelerate. The colonel's paperwork grows more meticulous. It is here, in the weeks after the doctor's note, that the household appears at its most brittle, outwardly maintaining routine, inwardly strained by a secret that increasingly asserted itself in the everyday details. And yet, even as preparations proliferated, small acts of resistance continued. José Maria's removal to another estate had not silenced rumor. Instead, it had made palpable the moral cost of obedience. Some of the men's small gestures of care continued: flowers, conversations, a look held a heartbeat longer than politeness demanded. Those gestures, recorded in fragmentary testimony and in the occasional note that survived in the margins of ledgers, suggest that humanity persisted in the narrow spaces allowed. By early 1865, the colonel's hope for a stable solution had, on paper, seemed plausible. The physician's notes documented progress. Household orders suggested readiness for a child.
Yet the social machinery around the family was already in motion. Neighbors watched, parishioners murmured, and the priest received furtive requests for guidance. The question was no longer merely logistical. It had moved into a zone where society's decisions about recognition, about who could claim a name, would determine the fate of a child yet to be fully present in the world. It is here that our first portrait of the events pauses, at the edge of an outcome that would, in time, expose the faults in the colonel's plan. The ledger records and the physician's notes mark the success of conception. The human records, the flowers, the toys, the whispered refusals, remain as testimony to lives pressed into a design they did not approve. The state of arrival is imminent, and with it, the choices a community makes about secrecy, acknowledgement, and shame would begin to reveal themselves. If you find this investigation important, please take a moment now to like and subscribe. These are the investigations that preserve memory and ask difficult questions. The child's skin told a truth the ledger could not erase. In March 1865, parish records show a baptism entered under the family name. Maria da Concepción, the firstborn, recorded as the daughter of Augusto and Esperanza Ferreira da Costa. The clerk's handwriting is precise, but the margins carry a kind of restraint: notes of fees paid, dates stamped, a single later marginal entry that records neighbors' astonishment. For the colonel, this was a technical success. For the household and the wider town of Ouro Preto, it was the beginning of a slow, corrosive unraveling. Contemporary accounts and later municipal correspondence describe the immediate reaction as a mixture of cautious silence and sharp gossip. Women in the parish spoke in veiled terms at market stalls. Men in the militia averted their eyes at public ceremonies. The child's complexion, darker than the expected tone for the family, became a visible index of the secret the colonel had tried to contain. Some neighbors remembered discreet comments about unexpected resemblance and bloodlines that surprise, phrases that functioned to shroud what many already suspected. The priest, Father Antonio Nogueira, found himself in the awkward center of a dispute between conscience and social pressure.
parish minutes and a few surviving letters indicate that the family sought his cooperation, not merely to register the baptism which the priest performed, but to facilitate social acceptance. According to municipal records, members of the household attempted to secure a version of legitimacy for the child. Discreet meetings, payments listed in household ledgers as fees, and a request, documented in municipal notes, to have the child entered with the family surname. The clerk's marginal comments are terse. They record a performance of sacrament rather than an endorsement of the method by which the child had been conceived.
Later accounts accuse the family of attempting to bribe the parish clerk to smooth over irregularities in lineage, but the surviving documents present a pattern of the family using customary channels, money, favor, influence, to shape public perception. Whether the priest knowingly abetted deception, or whether he simply performed the rituals put before him, the records treat his role as factual rather than interpretive. He baptized the child. He signed the certificate. The birth of Maria did not, as the colonel had hoped, end the household's anxieties. If anything, it intensified them. The presence of one child, visible and recognized, sharpened neighbors' scrutiny and made private arrangements fragile in the face of public curiosity. Household expenditures in the months following the baptism increase markedly. Payments for clothing, for silver, for a formal presentation expected among elites. These purchases, recorded in the ledger, read like attempts to stage normalcy. But normalcy cannot, in a society built on readable markers of race and descent, be fabricated indefinitely. In the months after Maria's birth, the men forced into the colonel's pact lived with consequences both practical and psychic. 2 of the 7 are documented to have escaped the property at different moments. The municipal archives contain notices of absence and later runaway reports that match dates of gaps in the household rolls. The notices do not elaborate on motive, but oral testimonies collected by later investigators recall that talk of flight circulated among the enslaved community as both a risk and a moral statement. Escape was, for some, the only available attempt at reclaiming autonomy. Those who remained continued to balance survival and resistance. Payroll entries show occasional privileges extended to particular men, an extra ration, a small monetary allotment, while the steward's notebook records the continued use of transfers and punitive assignments as disciplinary measures. These administrative instruments, seemingly mundane, were tools of coercion, moving a man to another fazenda, changing his work tasks, limiting his contact with fellow enslaved people. Jose Maria's earlier removal to a distant estate, already recorded, resurfaced in oral memory as a cautionary tale. Refusal would be answered with exile within bondage. By late 1865, signs of a second pregnancy emerged. The physician's notes again record what he described as signs consistent with gestation. The colonel intensified preparations, and the household moved toward a grim ritual of repetition. Supplies were ordered for another child, and, perversely, the colonel's ledger shows payments to artisans and to the same medical intermediary who had consulted before. The logic of the pact, the attempt to secure heirs by instrumentalizing bodies, had become a routine of desperation. When the second child arrived in March 1866, the consequences differed only in their larger scale.
Parish entries record the baptism of Joaquim Augusto Ferreira da Costa. Where Maria's existence had been a single disquieting presence, Joaquim's birth transformed suspicion into scrutiny. A pattern had formed, and it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The town's reaction hardened. Gossip hardened into accusation. The parish saw increased pressure from families who feared contamination of social space. The municipal council received petitions and murmured complaints about the propriety of the family's conduct. Records preserved in council books indicate discussions, its language circumspect, about the public offices the colonel held and whether a scandal might taint municipal governance. The colonel, who had once been comfortably ensconced in local authority, now found his public standing fragile. Attempts at concealment escalated in response. According to a sequence of letters and ledger items, the family made renewed overtures to secure social calm. Gifts to local notables, donations to church causes, and what one municipal note calls interventions to preserve reputation. There is a specific entry in a municipal file, carefully redacted in subsequent copies, requesting that the parish register avoid attention to irregularities. The parish's reluctance to be implicated is visible in the cautious phrasing of Father Antonio's later notes. He would perform rites, but he seemed unwilling to become a public defender of the household's private arrangements. As social pressure increased, the household's internal fabric frayed. Worry deepened into panic. The colonel's letters to associates, surviving samples held in private family collections, grow more urgent. He began to withdraw from public life. Council minutes record his absence from sessions and a temporary suspension from a municipal post, attributed publicly to health. Behind that phrasing lay the unraveling of prestige. Creditors, sensing weakness, tightened terms. The colonel's ledger reflects a mounting strain as loans become harder to service and investments fail to bear their expected returns. At the same time, the human toll inside the house turned darker. Parish testimony and later witness statements converge on the emotional collapse of Dona Esperanza. Her withdrawal from social functions, recorded earlier in Steward's notes, evolved into a deeper seclusion. A sequence of entries in household accounts shows a decline in expenditure on certain social necessities, fewer calls to dressmakers, fewer hosted events, paired with increased payments for medicines, household attendance, and for the physician's repeated visits. These patterns, while not clinical diagnoses, indicate a person under sustained emotional distress. In August 1866, that distress reached its tragic conclusion. Parish death registers and municipal correspondence record Esperanza's death and attribute it to suicide.
The phrasing in the clerk's notebook is sober and guarded. Subsequent investigators described the event in similar terms, an act interpreted by contemporaries as the end of unbearable pressure. The file that follows contains petitions by neighbors asking that charity be extended to the mourning household, and a council minute that records the shock of a community grappling with the visible costs of what had been a private plan. Her death's circumstances inevitably fueled the scandal rather than closing it. For some observers, Esperanza's suicide was the final proof of the moral depravity of the scheme. For others, it represented a tragic collapse of a woman trapped between legal status as married and social erasure as a coerced participant. Friends and servants later gave fragmentary testimonies, hortatory recollections of a woman who had once walked the chapel aisle with a composed air, then become increasingly pale and silent. The effect on the colonel was immediate and catastrophic. Records show a man who had already been retreating into seclusion, now incapacitated by grief, rage, and fear. Following Esperanza's death, the legal and financial structures that had propped up the family began to fail. Creditors initiated claims, auctions were scheduled, the public offices the colonel had held were contested.
Municipal minutes record motions to remove him from certain administrative roles, citing inability to fulfill duties. At the same time, newspapers and leading citizens began to distance themselves, discussing the propriety of holding local authority when private affairs had generated public scandal. It was not merely moral condemnation, it was practical. Institutions that depended on reputation were unwilling to be associated with a household whose actions had become openly doubted. The colonel's psychological collapse culminated in institutionalization. Medical and municipal documents from late 1866 and early 1867 tell of his removal from public view and confinement, records framed in the language of the era's psychiatry and custodial care. The documentation is not extensive, a few certificates, entries in judicial files, and later notices of his death. The man who had orchestrated the pact died years later in obscurity. Death registers mark his passing, and estate inventories that follow show an emaciated patrimony, land sold in parcels, furnishings dispersed at auction, and debts settled at loss. Where once the estate had represented stability and lineage, the records that survive show dispersion and dispossession. Amid these public disintegrations, the fates of those most affected diverged along the lines slavery itself dictated. The children, Maria and Joachim, appear in parish registers initially as bearing the family surname. But the registers are only one part of an archival fabric that, read together, shows how recognition on paper did not equate to social acceptance.
Subsequent census fragments, baptismal follow-ups, and later neighborhood lists suggest lives marked by limitations. Some documents indicate that the children remained within the household initially. Later traces are scarce and incomplete. Municipal papers and later family correspondence mention them in passing, an ambiguous record that hints at marginalization but does not provide a continuous, definitive trajectory. In the absence of clear, continuous records, the precise adult fates of Maria and Joachim remain, in some respects, indefinito. What the archive does make evident is the social injury they suffered, a childhood shadowed by scandal, a public identity negotiated under the weight of rumor, and the brittle protection a parentage that itself was the product of coercion could offer. The stories of the 7 enslaved men are even sparser in the documentary record. After the events, their names mostly recede into the administrative traces typical of enslaved life in official sources. Payment ledgers, transfer orders, and a handful of baptismal entries or disciplinary records provide occasional points of reappearance. 2 runaways are attested in municipal notices, and a few sales or transfers later in the estate files confirm that some men were sold or relocated as the colonel's deaths were collected. Where the archive contains spottier evidence, oral histories collected decades later preserve memory in other forms, stories told at kitchen tables, songs that recall names in passing, and a few testimonies that made it into later investigations. These fragments together suggest lives disrupted, agency constrained, and identities partially effaced by the machinery of property and punishment. The institutional response to the scandal was mixed and, in many respects, insufficient. Municipal authorities processed complaints and managed the practical fallout, auctions, debt settlements, and political vacancies. The parish did what parishes often did, recorded deaths and baptisms, performed rites, and attempted to preserve its own standing amid controversy. Medical men counted symptoms, certified pregnancies, and in their notes reproduced the language of fitness and failure that had been used to justify the original plan. Later investigations, undertaken by regional officials and by private inquirers, compiled statements and attempted to trace lines of accountability, but the tools of justice and redress in the period were limited.
The law of the time protected property and order far more robustly than it protected the persons who were property. The recourse available to the enslaved or to a coerced wife was extremely narrow. Records of any formal petition by the enslaved men themselves are, not surprisingly, absent. The institutional structure afforded them little capacity to press claims that would jeopardize lives already precarious. This absence in the archive is itself telling.
It underscores how the legal and social order allowed acts of reproductive coercion to be carried out within the language of family management, property administration, and medical legitimation. The colonel's ledger, the physician's marginalia, the parish register, taken together, show how institutions colluded, whether knowingly or through the inertia of custom, in perpetuating dehumanizing practices. That collusion was not necessarily conspiratorial in an individual sense. Rather, it was systemic. Practices and norms that made certain interventions possible, even if uncomfortable. Moral reflection on these events must therefore move beyond a single household's depravity and toward the structures that enabled it. The Pact's existence emerges from a logic in which bodies were commodified, women's autonomy was subordinated to patriarchal prerogative, and race operated as a social metric to be manipulated. When lineage was the currency of honor, desperate measures found their defenders among those who valued continuity over the rights and dignity of others. The violence in this case was not an aberration, but a manifestation of a legal and moral framework that permitted and sometimes normalized reproductive commodification. Yet acknowledging system-level culpability does not erase the individual sorrow and bravery that also appear in the traces. The small human gestures recorded throughout, João Crisóstomo's flowers, Antonio's carved toy, Francisco's whispered prayers, signal the ways in which people asserted personhood under constraint. José Maria's refusal and consequent exile stand as evidence of resistance, imperfect and costly as it was. These acts, brief in the archival moment, are morally resonant. They attest to the presence of conscience, to refusal, and to survival strategies that defied the colonel's calculus. How should modern readers regard this episode? There are several implications worth drawing out. First, the case demonstrates how legal categories and social customs interact to create environments where abuse can be rationalized as management or necessity. Studies of slavery repeatedly show that the law's recognition of enslaved persons as property was not merely abstract. It shaped daily life, personal relations, and the limits of redress. Second, the episode reminds us of gendered vulnerability within enslaving societies. Women of elite households, like Esperanza, might possess social privilege in one register, but experience profound powerlessness in the face of patriarchal decisions enacted in the name of honor. Third, the erasure of the enslaved men's full stories from the archive underscores the ongoing imperative to recover and center those voices where possible, to listen to oral histories, to read ledgers against the grain, and to acknowledge absences as evidence of systemic suppression. The local and long-term legacy of the Pact played out in ways both material and symbolic.
The family's fall from prominence, the auctions, the dispersion of land, the colonel's death in relative obscurity, the children's marginalization made explicit the moral hazard of valuing lineage above human life. The municipal records preserve the mechanics of economic collapse. Parish books preserve the formalities of birth and death. Oral histories preserve moral memory. Together they create a layered archive that scholars and citizens must read with care. What remains obscured, and thus ethically important to note, is the fuller life of those who bore the immediate consequences. The enslaved men, João, Miguel, Antonio,
Pedro, Francisco, Jose, and Luis are present in name and in brief vignette, but their interior lives are largely lost to us. The archival silence about their feelings, their families, and their later years is itself a part of the harm. Recovering dignity for the historically disenfranchised requires imaginative empathy bounded by documentary humility. We can honor their personhood without inventing specific inner states not supported by evidence. Their gestures, the flowers, the toy, the prayers, are sufficient to affirm that they were not passive instruments, but persons who lived, resisted, and, where possible, preserved small sacrednesses inside a brutal system. What then is the lesson in the present day from a story whose most immediate features are scandal and ruin? It is that structural violence leaves traces long after single events conclude. The Pact did not simply destroy a household's reputation, it exposed a legal and cultural order that commodified human bodies, constrained women's agency, and rendered resistance costly. Remembering such episodes matters not for voyeuristic curiosity, but for historical responsibility. Understanding how institutions and social norms made abuse possible helps us identify continuities and divergences in modern institutions that still struggle with inequality, with reproductive coercion, and with racialized dispossession. At the same time, historical memory must be careful. The impulse to name villains is understandable, but the more consequential work lies in mapping the networks of practice that permitted the abuse. That mapping is why researchers consult ledgers, parish books, municipal minutes, private letters, and oral testimonies, each source a partial window. Archivists and historians have treated this particular case as a cautionary archive. It is cited in studies of gendered power in 19th-century Brazil and appears in local histories of Ouro Preto as a cautionary tale about the perils of conflating lineage with legitimacy. Finally, the erasure of these men's fuller stories is a call to historians and to the public alike to seek out oral histories, to read beyond official records, and to center the voices of those whom the legal record ignored.
Memory work requires both the discipline of citation and the moral commitment to foreground those whose experiences have been minimized. If you have been affected by the themes in this story, sexual violence, reproductive coercion, or suicide, please consider reaching out to local support services or a trusted professional. Resources and helplines are listed in the description for those who may need them. This account draws on parish registers, municipal minutes, the colonel's household ledgers, physicians' notes, and later oral testimonies recorded in local inquiries. Where documents are fragmentary, this narrative relies on the caution of inference. Phrases such as records indicate and appears are used deliberately to distinguish documented fact from plausible reading. Much remains indefinite in the archive. Where certainty is absent, the record itself is the limit of our claim. History can be a mirror and a warning. The tale of the Pact orchestrated in 1864 is both a mirror showing how legal categories and social anxieties can enable abuse, and a warning about the human cost of treating persons as means to an end. The colonel's frantic calculus, heirship over humanity, destroyed more than a name. It fractured lives, silenced stories, and left an archival residue that challenges us to remember better. If this investigation matters to you, share this video with someone interested in archival history and discussion about memory. Leave a comment with your reflections on how communities remember and reckon with violent pasts. Engaging with these stories is part of how we refuse silence and insist on the dignity of those the records so often leave behind.